So, welcome to our final session on biblical idiots. We have been slightly irreverently looking at bad leadership examples from the Bible and looking at the mistakes that they made, and then obviously contrasting that with Jesus, who is definitely not a biblical idiot. He is the wisest person that's ever lived and the greatest leader that has ever lived, and teaches us how we should live. But we see so many of these examples of bad mistakes and terrible things to do in our responsibilities, in our leadership, in our workplace, in however you interpret that. So we've been looking at different ones, and today we are going to look at cowardice in the life of Pontius Pilate. But actually, a brief thing before then. Originally, when we had put together some of this material, we first of all called it fear as the negative thing, the bad trait in leadership to do. And someone pointed out to me, but fear is natural. Fear is normal. We're all going to be fearful at different times of different people or different situations. That's not sin. That's not wrong in itself. But when we allow that fear to paralyze us, to not do the right thing, that's cowardice. And there's nothing good that comes from cowardice, as one of my friends once said. There's nothing good that comes from cowardice. So it's not that the fear is wrong, but when that paralyzes us and we don't act and do the right thing, that is the wrong thing. That's the trap we need to not fall into. And the opposite of that we see in the life of Jesus is courage and protection. And there's even, I'm going to read from John's Gospel. Just earlier in John's Gospel, you see amazing examples of that when Jesus is being arrested and his courage in the face of that physical threat, and then the way that he protects his disciples. I love that when they say, he says, "Who is it you're coming for?" And they say, "Jesus of Nazareth." Okay, that's me. If you're coming for me, let these people go. And as the leader, he steps up and takes responsibility, deflects attention or tension or danger away from his team, protects them, and courageously stands up for what is right. And Jesus always does that. I mean, we see him courageously stepping in for the woman accused of adultery who is about to be stoned. He's not afraid to risk certainly his own reputation, maybe even physical danger. Would he have been in then? I don't know, but he's not afraid to speak up and do the right thing. He's courageous. He is never cowardly. And courage inspires other people. If we want to have a great reason, again, for exhibiting that in our leadership, being courageous is inspiring to other people. I don't know if you've just seen in the news this week, Time has announced their Person of the Year. And this year, in 2022, it is President Zelensky from the Ukraine. Kind of a very obvious, but surely right choice, one of the most inspirational leaders of this year. Why? Because he has been so courageous in the face of physical danger. And at the beginning of that war, when everyone was saying, you need to leave Ukraine, let's get you out as the president, we need to make sure that your life is preserved and you can continue still to be president and try and govern from in exile. And he says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be effective in doing that. And how can I actually ask all of the Ukrainians to stay and fight if I'm the one who is perceived to be running away? And because he stayed, that act of courage has inspired so many people, not only in Ukraine, but then outside of Ukraine, to support what is going on there. I think the war would have taken a very different course had he left. And therefore, I think it's entirely right that he's been recognized by Time. He is Man of the Year, Person of the Year for 2022 because of his courage and because of the way that inspires. So that's what we're after. That's how God calls us to live and to lead, being courageous and standing up for what is right, even in the face of danger, rather than being cowardly. I'm going to read from John's Gospel, chapter 18, verse 28, through to chapter 19, verse 16. So quite long. This is the trial of Jesus in John's Gospel, and we see the cowardice of Pontius Pilate. And I want you to note especially 3 times, this is the repeated theme in this section, 3 times Pilate says, I find no basis to charge this man. In effect, 3 times, Pilate declares Jesus as innocent. Pilate is the governor of Roman Judea. I mean, what he says goes. He's in charge of the province. How is it that even though this guy 3 times declares Jesus innocent, he ends up ordering him crucified? Well, I think it shows what happens when leaders act in a cowardly way. And we'll see how Pilate is afraid of, well, Caiaphas and the Jewish leaders, and then Caiaphas is afraid especially of the crowd and fearing their reaction. And then ultimately, he's afraid of Jesus himself, the guy that he's put on trial. But that fear is not as strong as his fear of the crowd and his fear of the Jewish leaders. And that's why he ends up making the cowardly decision of enabling Jesus to be crucified. And it's not even as though he doesn't want that decision, but he is too weak to stand up to the evil men and then to the mob screaming for Jesus's blood because of his cowardice. And therefore we know what happens as a result. You know, the one innocent man in all of history ends up being executed because of this cowardice. So I'm going to read quite a long section, but it's worth reading it in full. John chapter 18, verse 28 through to chapter 19, verse 16. Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If you were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," the Jews objected. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked. "Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then?" said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" Pilate asked. With this, he went out again to the Jews and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him." So that's the first declaration of innocence. "But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him in the face. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jews insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to be crucified. Okay, 3 times Jesus is declared innocent by Pilate. 3 times he says, "I find no reason for a charge against this man." Why is it that he is not able, therefore, to just release him and do the right thing? Because Pilate is acting cowardly. He's afraid of Caiaphas and the Jewish leaders. He's afraid, ultimately, of the whole mob, of it turning into a rebellion. And then he becomes afraid of Jesus. Ironically, he's also afraid that his reputation is going to be ruined. If there's a riot that happens in Judea, then the report is going to get back to Caesar in Rome, and he's probably going to lose his position. He's going to lose any chance of promotion and the decent next job, in a better outposting in the middle of nowhere that he probably sees Judea is. He's afraid of things getting out of hand. He's afraid of his reputation being damaged, which forces him into all of these wrong choices. Ironically, he keeps making the wrong choices and his reputation is still trashed by the end of it. Think of what has happened by the end of this scene. He has, first of all, released a murderer. Barabbas took part in an insurrection. He's released this guy who is guilty. Then he has an innocent man, Jesus, brutally flogged and tortured. And then ultimately, he has him handed over to be crucified. And still, at the end of all that, Pilate's reputation is diminished. It's not enhanced by all of this. It's made worse because of his cowardice. How does that happen? I think there's several decisions Pilate makes. Each of them show the cowardliness, the fear of doing the right thing. So first of all, when Jesus is handed over to him, there's a bit of an exchange. It's like, "Are you the king of the Jews? Who handed you over to me? What are you doing here?" And he realizes, no, this guy's innocent. There's no reason for him to be crucified, and he should release him there. But unfortunately, Pilate then tries to be clever, and he thinks, Caiaphas and the Jewish leaders have handed Jesus over to me. They want a conviction, and yes, they want a crucifixion. But Pilate's like, can I satisfy 2 things here? I could convict Jesus, but then I could also release him, and therefore my conscience is clear because I've not condemned this guy who's innocent, but I'm also kind of giving a sop to the Jewish leaders by declaring him as guilty and yet then letting him off. So he says, okay, we've got this tradition of the amnesty. How about I release a person? I'll release this guy, the king of the Jews. And then obviously it gets out of hand because the Jewish leaders have stirred up the crowd to chant for Barabbas instead. And so first mistake is not releasing Jesus when he should have just having declared him innocent, but then trying to be clever, ever the politician, trying to use this Passover amnesty as the gambit, thinking, yeah, I can have my cake and eat it. It all goes wrong. He ends up having to release a murderer who's actually led an insurrection trying to rebel against Rome. That's not going to make him popular with Caesar and with his bosses back in Rome, but he's backed into the corner. So he has to do this crazy thing of letting the murderer go. And then instead of still releasing Jesus, Pilate thinks, okay, let me be clever again. I'll have him flogged. And that was a brutal torture. I mean, many people died during floggings before crucifixions because it was so violent, the way that they whipped and beat the prisoners. But Pilate thought, if I have him scourged and flogged in that way, I'll get sympathy from the crowd. I'll bring him out and the crowd will be like, oh, this is terrible what they've done to this innocent guy. And therefore, okay, I flogged him, but at least I'll be able to release him. So he has him flogged, brings him out before the crowd. Look, here is the man. He's probably totally shocked still by the crowd reaction because the Jewish leaders have stirred this up. And they're like, no, crucify. And he's like, what on earth is going on? But still, he refuses to release him, goes back in and chats with Jesus, realizes that Jesus is not just any ordinary person, and that whole thing. We have a law that he needs to die because he claimed to be the Son of God. And so now, as I said, he's not only afraid of the Jewish leaders, he's not only afraid of the crowd, he starts to be afraid of Jesus, this broken, brutalized guy standing in front of him, but who clearly still has a majesty in his person that shows Pilate, this guy is not like anyone else who has stood before him. Finally, Pilate tries to become determined to do the right thing and release him, but the whole crowd then start to say, no, if you release him, you're no friend of Caesar. And again, I guess it goes back to Pilate's reputation. There's even some people say that friend of Caesar was an official title that was given to different, Roman officials that had done especial great things. Was Pilate already, had he been given that title, or was he hoping to be given that title? And the crowd are saying, no, we're going to give a report back that there's no way you're going to get this, because if you let free a guy who's plotted an insurrection against Rome, you're no friend of Caesar. Ironically, that's exactly what Pilate has just done. He let Barabbas go, who has plotted a rebellion against Rome. You see how his cowardice compounds and creates all of these terrible actions that happen. But ultimately, he could still release Jesus at that point, but he's afraid of a rebellion. He's afraid that the mob is going to get out of hand, and he's afraid of what the report is going to be going back to Rome. So he says, really? You honestly want me to kill your king? Shall I crucify this king? Yes, the answer comes back. And then, we know the story from Matthew's gospel. It's not included in this, when he calls for water and tries to wash his hands of the responsibility. Maybe that's one of the biggest lessons from this. We can't wash our hands of our own responsibilities. If you've been given a role, if you're in a leadership position, you can't cave in to the will of the crowd and say, well, it's not my fault. You guys have made this decision. I wash my hands of this responsibility. That's cowardice. That inspires no one. That reduces us in the eyes of everybody else, in the eyes of people that we're trying to lead, in the eyes of the world, rather than enhancing any profile that we may have. Pilate could have come out of this whole situation with his reputation enhanced had he stood up for the right thing and said, you guys have brought me this guy because you're jealous of him. I find no basis for a charge against him, so I'm just going to release him. No clever political ploy and gambit, no Passover amnesty, no whipping and scourging and torturing him. Just, he's innocent, I'm going to release him. But he can't do that, or he's too afraid to do that, because he's cowardly, because he's afraid of the people that he's trying to interact with the other Jewish leaders. And ultimately, he becomes afraid of the very people that he is supposed to lead. As Roman governor of Judea, you can't be afraid of the population, even when they're threatening you or disagreeing with you. You've still got to do what is right. In whatever leadership role you have, whether it's in family, whether it's in work, whether it's in church, when we start to be afraid of the negative reaction of others, we forfeit the right to lead, because then we're never going to make good decisions. Cowardice is trying to always take the easy option, the path of least resistance, being afraid to be courageous and to stand up for what is right. Pilate, unfortunately, is the brilliant example of cowardice, of trying to get out of doing the right thing by being clever, which ends up digging yourself a hole and making the whole situation worse. Whereas Jesus is the amazing example of being courageous, of being protective of other people, of always standing up to do the right thing, which will then inspire others rather than, what's the opposite of inspire? Disinspire, turn people off, make people turn away and walk away. That's why Pilate is the last in our series on biblical idiots. Don't allow yourself to become afraid of those that you're trying to lead or influence, or not that the fear itself is wrong or sin. When you are afraid, think, but actually, what's the right thing to do? Even if I'm scared of the consequences of doing this, even if there's uncertainty, even if, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to stand up for the right thing, because that's always the right thing to do. And you can't wash your hands of the things that you've been given responsibility for. Even if it's unpopular, do the right thing, because that's going to inspire others. And that is going to hopefully, further justice, further the things of the kingdom, enable you to fulfill the role that you have taken on. Don't fall into the trap of being so afraid that you then make the wrong decision and try and give in to the crowd. Okay.